As with many political earthquakes, there's always an epicenter, a moment that we can look at and say that's the point when and where the earth started to tremor. In the case of the city of Chicago, everyone knew that the death of longtime Mayor Richard J. Daley would cause seismic shifts in Chicago's political landscape. But it would be a 38-hour blizzard that would cripple Chicago that forever changed Chicago politics. This blizzard led to the city's first female mayor, which eventually led to the city's first black mayor. In this story of Chicago's mayoral elections, we're going to talk about the elections of 1979 and 1983. Hello, welcome to Election History. My name is Dave, and I do videos about campaigns, elections, candidates, political parties, and so on. And in today's video, we're going to talk about the 1979 and 1983 mayoral elections in Chicago. On a personal note, the 1983 election is the first election that I remember as a child, as I would watch the news nightly as a 9-year-old living in the Chicago suburb of Hanover Park. So I've always wanted to make a video on these elections. The sources that I used were contemporaneous newspapers at the time, as well as the book's Campaign, The Election That Rocked Chicago by former Chicago reporter Peter Nolan, and The Making of the Mayor of Chicago in 1983, written by Melvin Holly and Paul Green. The link for those books are down below in the description. And I'd also like to do one shout out to MediaBurn.org, which is a nonprofit organization which preserves tapes, and a lot of their tapes are from the Chicagoland area, so they have a lot of news reports and all that. And much of what you see in this video comes from their archive. So go ahead and check them out. Thank you all very much at MediaBurn.org. Greatly appreciate you allowing me to use the videos that you have on your website. The 1983 Chicago race for mayor was unique. The Chicago political machine, which had been run by former Mayor Richard J. Daley with an iron fist, was now backing incumbent Mayor Jane Byrne, who was running for re-election. However, Richard M. Daley, the former mayor's son, decided to throw his hat into the ring. Another candidate, Harold Washington, became the first African-American candidate with a chance to beat the Chicago Democratic machine. Washington's surge would eventually lead to Republican Bernard Epton coming within a whisker of being Chicago's first Republican mayor in a generation. But how did we get here? First, let's look at the former mayor, Richard J. Daley. Richard J. Daley had been mayor of Chicago for 21 years. Daley was known for his heavy-handed tactics as mayor. The most prominent of these examples was probably the use of the Chicago police force to squash the protests at the 1968 Democratic Convention. However, many Chicagoans saw Daley as a no-nonsense mayor who stood up for his citizens. Also, Daley's time in office was known as a time of corruption, which would be well known throughout the city. But it was one of those situations where many citizens were willing to live with the corruption as long as the potholes were filled, the streets were plowed, and the city ran quite efficiently. He was also a backroom deal maker. While many politicians nowadays go through the correct procedure of negotiating with unions, contractors, businesses, and the likes by signing contracts, Daley was more of a handshake type of a person, rarely getting into negotiations that could find the city winding up in a courtroom. While many people were pleased with the direction of the city, there were some people who weren't. African Americans were probably top on that list, as Daley was more likely to spend money on massive highway projects and urban renewal than using the money to build poorer communities, which included African Americans. He also had a negative view of Martin Luther King Jr., and when King was assassinated and rioting happened in Chicago, Daley issued a shoot to kill order on those committing arson and looting. So many African Americans saw this as further oppression against the Black community by Daley. However, Daley, being a highly skillful political strategist, knew that he needed just enough African Americans on his side to continue winning election after election. This was done by either patronage jobs, which was usually done through the streets and sanitation department, or by political patronage by making someone an important person within the Democratic Party. Lawyer Roy Washington was one of those people, and when he passed away, Roy's precinct was passed on to his son Harold Washington. Harold, who Daley was impressed with after seeing him speak at the 10th anniversary of the founding of Roosevelt University in 1955, also didn't rock the boat at first, but as he got older, he created a lot more waves. For most of Chicago, this system worked, but on December 20th, 1976, Mayor Daley kicked the bucket in his doctor's office and the mayor was no more. And with this being Chicago, determining who would succeed Daley was just as shady. Many thought that Wilson Frost, president pro tempore of the city council, would become the mayor upon the death of Daley. Frost and 10th Ward Alderman Ed Verdoliak went to the mayor's office, but the doors were closed. The keys to those offices were held by two Daley men, Thomas Donovan, Daley's administrative assistant, and Frank Sullivan, the late mayor's press secretary. Both men were loyal to the late mayor, who hailed from the 11th Ward. But both Frost and Verdoliak knew that it was the 11th Ward who was now in control of who would become the temporary mayor. And of course, many of the patronage jobs that were dished out during Daley's time in office were at stake if somebody else came in and took away those jobs that mostly came from the 11th Ward. The alderman for the 11th Ward was Michael Blandick. Daley's old machine would solidify support for Blandick, making him the temporary successor until the election of a new mayor on June 7th, 1977, when a newly elected mayor would take on the full responsibility of the office. Blandick originally said that he was only going to be a caretaker mayor at first, which would have given somebody else the opportunity from either the Black or Polish community to be elected mayor during the election. But Blandick decided that he liked being mayor and he decided to run. Legendary Chicago writer Mike Royko wrote of Blandick, quote, "He has shown that he has one traditional qualification for the job of Chicago mayor. He can look people in the eye while lying his head off," end of quote. Blandick would win that primary with 51.1% of the vote, with Northwest Side Alderman and former Congressman Roman Pajinski winning 32.7%. State Senator Harold Washington, in his first ever run for mayor, won 10.7%. Now, when it comes to Michael Blandick, it's kind of hard to describe him. He wasn't a good politician, as he really didn't know how to mingle with the voters. He wasn't a good technocrat, as a lot of the actions done by his administration were done through his staff. And to say that he was just a figurehead wouldn't be accurate either, as he was involved with the politics of the city, even if he wasn't paying attention to every little detail. Essentially, the city of Chicago and the Democratic Party machine was tailor-made for Richard J. Daley and not anyone else. It was going to be a tight fit for Blandick. Blandick did some positive things for the city, such as creating Chicago Fest, which was the precursor of today's Taste of Chicago. The Chicago Marathon also had its first running, with Blandick, an avid runner himself, also competing. However, corruption continued. In early 1978, the Chicago Sun-Times reported that the city inspectors were on the take, turning a blind eye to plumbing and electrical code violations, in which a few inspectors were criminally charged. There was also tragedy under Blandick's watch, as Chicago's famous L train had a collision on the loop, leading to 12 deaths. It was a mixed bag for Blandick. During his time as mayor, there were a number of labor disputes. Unlike Daley, who was able to make deals behind closed doors, which was rarely noticed by the media, Blandick's approach was very public, which didn't bode well for the mayor. One of the strikes that was very public, but eventually settled, was the Chicago taxi driver strike against yellow cab and checker cab companies. Blandick was able to come to terms with the cab companies by supporting a fare increase that would cover the salaries that the cabbies were demanding. However, there was one person who was suspicious of how the deal with the taxi companies went down, and that was Jane Byrne. Byrne, who was the consumer sales commissioner at the time, contacted William Griffin, who was a reporter at the Chicago Tribune, and told him that fraud and conspiracy might have been involved with the deal and that Mayor Blandick knew about it. Byrne would not go public with the story immediately because she was afraid it could affect her daughter's university studies at Notre Dame. Because of this, and the Tribune not being able to find any more evidence to corroborate her story, the Tribune decided not to run with it. However, two big hitters in Chicago journalism, Mike Royko of the Chicago Daily News and WBBM Channel 2's Walter Jacobson, decided to run with the story. Now, one of the reasons why the Tribune might not have run the story was because the paper's attorney, Don Rubin, was also the attorney for both Checker and Yellow Cab companies. Now, with Byrne bringing her claims publicly, she said that the Tribune was trying to kill the story. She also met with U.S. Attorney Thomas Sullivan to discuss the matter. Bernard Carey, Cook County State's attorney, investigated the allegations as well. Eventually, there was nothing that could be pinned to Blandick, and Byrne was fired as Consumer Sales Commissioner on November 21st, 1977. On March 28th, 1978, Byrne announced that she would run against Blandick for mayor. Another problem that Blandick had during his time as mayor was weather. In 1978, an extreme blizzard covered most of the industrial Midwest, with Chicago receiving about a foot of snow. While this did somewhat paralyze Chicago, it also had a devastating impact throughout the region, with some cities like South Bend, Indiana, receiving over 2 feet of snow. Chicago was able to get back to normal quite easily after the 1978 blizzard. The same could not be said in 1979. On New Year's Eve 1978, snow started to fall in Chicago during the early morning hours. But 38 hours later, nearly 2 feet of snow buried Chicago in one of the worst blizzards in the city's history. 1 year after the blizzard, a group of scientists commissioned by the governor wrote a report on the impact of the blizzard. Let me go ahead and read directly from their report here. Major impacts were initially felt in the metropolitan-oriented transportation systems. These included blockage and halting of surface transportation involving both trains and vehicles, and stoppage of air transportation. In essence, the transportation problems led to a series of secondary impacts related to the change in human and commercial activities because of delays or cancellations of transportation systems. The absenteeism from employment, lack of deliveries, lack of shopping, and canceling of meetings and vacations had subsequent effects on commerce and industry. The problems were compounded in another series of major secondary or ensuing impacts on government institutions involved with snow removal, street repair, delivery of mail, and firefighting. Another set of major direct impacts on the severe winter related to structures. Here, damage to the roofs were a noticeable problem. These led to secondary impacts on human activities, personal loss, cost of individuals and businesses, and subsequent more business for repair companies. Public utilities formed another area of initial impacts. The severity of the storms, although not as bad in 1978 and 79 as in the prior winter because of fewer severe ice storms and blizzards, led to impacts on the utility companies as reflected by damage to their lines, poles, and structures. But this post-blizzard report that I just read from only told half the story. Chicago's rail system, known as the L, which is short for elevated since most of the system is above ground, would only stop in certain places, usually zipping by African American communities. Community activist Nancy Jefferson said that people saw this as a personal insult and that Jane Byrne picked up strong support in the black wards after these incidences. On top of that, the L saw a number of derailments, which was caused by snow accumulating on the tracks. But it wasn't just the L. The city was in disarray. For example, the city published a list of parking lots that were to be available for people to park their cars. But when the list was published, they used the wrong addresses. The streets weren't being plowed, the trash wasn't being picked up, transportation was at a standstill, and people were essentially stuck in their homes. The only exception to this reality was the Bridgeport community, where both the Dailies and Blandick hailed from. The Chicago Tribune reported that, quote, Bridgeport alleys had been plowed and cleaned, and garbage had been collected. No one seemed to have any complaints, end of quote. But it wasn't just a blizzard that affected the upcoming Democratic primary for mayor, which was to be held in February. Former Deputy Mayor Kenneth Sain, was receiving contracts to look at administrative deficiencies in Chicago. Once he left office in 1977, Blandik's administration sent a number of contracts to Sain, totaling $242,000, which would be around $1.2 million in today's money as of 2025. Two of these contracts looked at the city's snow and ice removal, totaling $90,000. The Chicago Tribune would further report on how millions of dollars under Blandik's government went to well connected officials and large donors to the Democratic Party. The paper, that had refused to report Jane Byrne's accusations against Blandik in the taxi company labor dispute, were now filling their front pages with the corruption that rotted his administration. Under Daley, there was a lot of shady stuff going on, but the city ran well. Under Blandik, it didn't. Still, the Democratic machine politicians were praising Blandik's effort, even if the average Chicagoan was tired of him. This praise did get to Blandik's head, giving him a god complex. Like, no, really, the guy compared himself to Jesus Christ. Attending a meeting of Democratic precinct captains when Blandik said, quote, "In the early history of Christianity, you see a leader starting with 12 disciples. They crucified the leader and made martyrs of others. And what was the result? Christianity is better and stronger than it was before." He continued by saying, quote, "It's our turn to be in the trenches to see if we are made of the same stuff as the early Christians, the persecuted Jews, the proud Poles, the blacks, the Latinos," end of quote. Blandik said this on February 14th, 1979. The Democratic primary was just 13 days away. Now, before we continue, if you like videos about campaigns and elections, please like the video and subscribe to the channel and click the little bell for notifications about new videos. You can also join my Patreon to support the channel. The link is in the description below, where I put Patreon-only members' videos. Now, back to this video. Even with all the backlash against Blandik and only a few weeks until the election, there wasn't much talk about the Byrne campaign. Most of the media was focused on Blandik, such as donations to his campaign from people who had been awarded city contracts. Still, Byrne was campaigning. During the L train issue, Byrne would go to stations that were being passed by trains, winning support of local voters. She won the support of non-machine organizations such as the Chicago Student Union and groups of black clergymen. The media wasn't paying much attention to Byrne and still focused on Blandik's campaign, which was more focused on solidifying the Democratic machine vote. But Blandik was spending less time on the campaign as his mother was critically ill, with his wife Heather attending campaign events in his place. The mayor's mother would die on February 24th, 1977, just 3 days before the primary election. The day before the election, many in the Democratic Party thought that Blandik would be the winner, even though polls had him down to Jane Byrne. The Democratic Party machine was relying on low voter turnout, as they knew they had a solid 350,000 votes in their corner. As for the Byrne campaign, they needed a high turnout, with over 700,000 in order to be confident of winning. And a poll released by WBBN TV the night before the primary showed that Byrne was actually ahead of Blandik 47 to 45%. Luckily for Byrne, the turnout was high and she won 51% to 49%. This was the first time in recent years that the Democratic machine was defeated. With Byrne's victory, many in the machine lined up to congratulate her. This wasn't necessarily because those machine politicians lost the election, but more of an olive branch so that the machine could work with Byrne in the general election. If not, the machine could turn against Byrne and support her Republican opponent, Wallace D. Johnson. But almost immediately after the election, Byrne, who had spent the last year and a half berating those in the Democratic Party, made amends and transitioned back into party politics. She would easily win the general election with 82% of the vote on April 3rd. Entering the mayor's office, it was immediately apparent that the city was in financial trouble. The city had to borrow $64 million to pay the bills, yet Byrne authorized the remodeling of the mayor's office, increasing pay to executives by 15% and tripling her public relations staff. But even with some of her frivolous spending, she planned to take an axe to many of those who held patronage positions left over from the Daley years. She first removed a number of ward superintendents who she said was simply taking public money without any work. Many of those cuts were in the 11th ward, with the late mayor's son, State Senator Richard M. Daley, running things now. But she also used the power of firing patronage employees to wield her political power. For example, when Jane Byrne wanted the Democrats in the Illinois State Assembly to pass some legislation, and Michael Madigan, the Democratic Majority Leader, was holding things up, she fired Michael Cardilli, who was one of Madigan's top ward officers. This put Madigan back in line and made him a loyal follower of the new mayor. The mayor needed a new staff, and she quickly hired William Griffin, yes, the Tribune reporter that I mentioned earlier, to be her chief of staff, and Mike Brady, a state representative, as her head of intergovernmental affairs. One of the first priorities that Byrne needed to deal with was finding a new police chief for the city. Griffin recommended Joe DeLeonardi, the chief of homicide detectives for the city. Once he was appointed as acting police chief, DeLeonardi started going after organized crime. To help him, he brought in William Duffy, who is an expert on organized crime, replacing William Hanhart, who was rumored to be connected with the Chicago outfit. Another person rumored to have been connected to the mob was Fred Rohde, the first ward alderman. When Rohde noticed that plainclothes policemen were following him, he asked the mayor's office why he was being tailed. On January 11th, DeLeonardi was replaced with Richard Brazick, and now the full-time police chief. On April 15th, DeLeonardi and Duffy were demoted by Brazick, saying that it was an internal issue and had nothing to do with the mayor's office. However, with Byrne's closer ties to Rohde as well as John Darko, the Democratic committeeman for the First Ward, who is said to have mob ties, many in the media expected the mayor's office to be more involved than they were leading on. A few days later, on April 19th, demoted Deputy Superintendent James Zawarski charged that those in the First Ward organizations were involved with organized crime. A few hours later, DeLeonardi and Duffy backed up the claims. DeLeonardi further claimed that both Griffin and Brady had asked him to fire Duffy because the mayor's office was getting pressure from those in the First Ward, which both men denied. Because this was mostly a case of hearsay, nobody was charged. In another interesting move around the time when DeLeonardi was removed as acting police chief, Byrne appointed her husband, Jake McMullen, as press secretary. McMullen was a former reporter, so he knew the ropes when it came to the media. However, his approach to handling the press was extremely heavy-handed, often coming across as a loose cannon wanting to settle personal scores for him and the mayor instead of informing the public about the city's affairs. McMullen constantly threatened to punch reporters, as well as threatened to take their credentials away if they got mad at the press. It was not the best look for Jane Byrne. A number of strikes took place during her tenure as well. The Chicago Transit Authority workers went on strike, though it was resolved relatively quickly. When the teachers went on strikes, schools returning in January of 1980 did not have any teachers. After 2 weeks, the dispute was settled. But next would be the firefighters, who hit the picket line on February 14th in the middle of the night without any warning. During her campaign, she promised the firefighters a new contract, but to that point had rejected all the proposals. Over half of the firehouses were closed during the strike, but the city had over 600 new recruits that could fill in. However, it wasn't as effective or professional as having the seasoned firefighters. She was able to end the 23-day strike with the help of Jesse Jackson, who had openly been calling her policies racist after skipping over black candidates for police chief when Brazick was appointed. That's how bad things had gotten for Byrne. Just after 1.5 years in office, 43% of Chicagoans rated her performance as poor, with only 14% saying that she was doing an excellent job as mayor. There was even a bill introduced in Springfield to establish a recall procedure for the mayor, introduced by Senator Harold Washington. On top of these problems, Byrne made some major political and publicity blunders. First, after saying that she would support President Jimmy Carter in his primary against Ted Kennedy, she changed over to Kennedy, but only after holding a fundraiser for Jimmy Carter before at McCormick Place, the largest convention venue in the world at that time. Another ill advised move was when the mayor and her husband decided to move to Cabrini Green, a public housing project with many problems that was popularized by the TV sitcom Good Times. Many African Americans saw this as a publicity stunt, especially after Byrne removed two black members of the Chicago Board of Education and replaced them with two white members, with one even saying that they were strongly opposed to school desegregation. However, the bright side of her stay at Cabrini Green was that she was able to realize the problems that plagued the neighborhood. One of the problems she said that she noticed was drugs, and she thought that organized crime was behind the drug trade. Byrne contacted Fred Rohde and told him that she was going to be cracking down on drugs, in which Rohde said he didn't know anything about drugs in Cabrini Green. She also contacted Chicago outfit mobster Anthony Spilotro and used the same wording, but he also said that they were not involved with drugs. So, if you are wondering if there's any question as to whether Byrne had communication with the Chicago mob, there you go. Oh, and if you are wondering, yes, Anthony Spilotro was the character that Joe Pesci played in the movie Casino. Byrne and her husband did take criticism personally, and in her early days, when she saw that firing people could sway people like Michael Madigan, it also made her enemies. One of those enemies was State Senator Richard M. Daley. The 11th Ward firings that I mentioned earlier impacted Daley. While most of the Democratic Party machine in Chicago lined up behind Byrne when she decided to play ball with them after the primary, those in the 11th Ward remained loyal to the Daley family. Removing those in the 11th Ward, as well as those who had been personally close to the Daley family, not only solidified her power with less possible opposition, but also removed the political machine that was loyal to Daley, who was increasingly being seen as her main opponent in the 1983 election. With Daley being out of machine politics, he couldn't use patronage to garner support. They would have to fight the old-fashioned way. They would need to earn it. And with that, let's talk about Richard Daley. Of course, Richard M. Daley was the son of the late mayor of Chicago, Richard J. Daley. Unlike his father, who was a jovial man when he walked around City Hall talking to reporters and others who were milling about, Richard Jr. was more shy and reserved. Still, he was someone who had political ambition, and in 1972 won the state Senate seat that his father had held previously. It was in that position that he was an ardent defender of his father's policies, with many thinking that he was simply there because of his last name, with Chicago Magazine calling Daley one of the 10 worst members of the General Assembly. But once his father died, his demeanor changed. No longer was he a diehard supporter of the mayor, but a serious state senator looking to get things done, taking on nursing home abuse, voting against pay raises for legislators, and battling to remove the sales tax on food and medicine. Daley was now being seen in a positive light, even from his former adversaries. He became someone who wasn't just simply a Daley, but someone who wanted to provide good governance. In 1980, Daley decided to leave the state legislature and run for Cook County State's attorney. By this time, Daley had been considered an independent Democrat, not connected to the party machine. However, because he still had the name Daley, he was still considered a possible opponent for Chicago mayor in 1983. Knowing this to be the case, Byrne and her machine decided to run Alderman Edward Burke, who was also endorsed by former mayor Michael Bolandic, against Daley. But Daley, like Jane Byrne a year earlier, defeated the Democratic machine and won the party's nomination. He would go up against Republican Bernard Carey, and the race was expected to be close. Remember, this was for a Cook County position, not just in Chicago, which meant that the heavily Republican suburbs played a role. On election day, Daley Daley would win by only around 16,000 votes of over 2 million votes cast. As the administration of Jane Byrne remained unpopular, Daley was seen as the most likely candidate to defeat Jane Byrne in the upcoming mayoral Democratic primary. He ended up creating a machine of his own as his organization collected over 300,000 signatures to get him on the ballot, which became the backbone of his organization, as well as those who still had loyalty to the Daley family. Daley was expected to defeat Byrne as he would get old Richard J. Daley voters, as well as a large segment of the black community, which was very angry with Byrne. So, on November 4th, 1982, Richard M. Daley announced that he was running as a Democratic candidate for mayor. Of course, this worried Byrne, who saw black voters as a large group of voters that would probably not vote for her. The best possible way to be reelected as mayor was to have some black support peel off to another candidate. Because she was so unpopular with African Americans, she knew she couldn't just rely on low turnout. So the idea of having a black candidate in the race to take enough votes away from Daley was floated, as this would definitely help Byrne's candidacy. But what if a black candidate were popular enough that they could actually win the Democratic primary, since Byrne and Daley would split white voters? That's exactly what the black community thought, and they were behind Harold Washington. Now, Washington wasn't the vocal black activist like many in Chicago at that time. When he entered politics, he was somewhat part of the machine, but as time passed, he would move away from machine politics. This first started when Richard J. Daley wanted black politicians and leaders who owed their jobs to the party to form a committee to support Mayor Daley's housing initiatives in the face of Martin Luther King's visit to Chicago in 1966. Washington reluctantly joined, but once he was elected to the state assembly, he became more independent as he only voted for the party machine endorsed legislation when he needed to. In 1975, Washington decided to run for Speaker of the Illinois State Assembly against Mayor Daley's choice, Clyde Choate. While neither candidate would win, as William Redmond would eventually be chosen and supported by both Daley and Washington, it showed that Washington wasn't going to toe the line for the Chicago Democratic Party machine. A year later, Washington ran for the Illinois State Senate and won, but with timid support from Richard J. Daley. Once in the Senate, Washington immediately decided to run for state Senate president, but would eventually lose to Tom Hines of Chicago, who had the Chicago political machine's endorsement, including Richard J. Daley. This seriously affected the relationship between the party regulars and independents, of which Washington could be counted amongst its ranks. A few months later, after the death of Richard J. Daley, Washington decided to run for mayor of Chicago in the 1977 special election. During the election, Washington's conviction for not filing tax returns came up, which took a hit on his reputation. On the night of the primary, Washington only received 10.7% of the vote. Washington decided not to run for re-election to the Illinois State Senate and instead ran for the 1st Congressional District in Chicago. He beat incumbent Bennett Stewart in 1980 and was unopposed in 1982. There was Republican opposition, but Washington won over 95% of the vote both times. When it came time to throw his name into the ring for Chicago mayor in 1983, he was worried he couldn't win. From his years of experience running in Chicago, he thought that he could probably win a large percentage of the black vote, especially against Jane Byrne. His worry was turnout, as black voters historically had low turnout in Chicago, which made many black leaders hesitant to enter citywide races. But with an aggressive voter registration drive, which registered 100,000 new black voters, as well as a strong Draft Washington movement, on November 10th, 1982, 6 days after Daley's announcement, Harold Washington announced that he was a candidate for mayor from the Hyde Park Hilton Hotel. 12 days later, on November 22nd, Byrne announced that she was entering the race. The next day, the Cook County Democratic Party endorsed her candidacy. In this run for mayor, she looked different. The campaign had hired a media and image consultant, mostly from New York, to change her looks. She went from looking like a typical Chicago mom to wearing fancy clothes and always having her hair made up. It was a complete image makeover for Byrne. And while a lot of voters didn't want Byrne as mayor anymore, polls showed that she was perceived as powerful, taking no nonsense from anybody. 8 days later, the Republicans were deciding who to run for mayor. In Chicago, Republicans were no longer a strong opposition party, being seen more as a protest party instead of one that could actually win. Bernard Epton, a state representative from Hyde Park, would be the party's nominee. Epton was a fiscal conservative, but a socially moderate to liberal Republican. When Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and killed in Memphis in 1968, Epton went to Memphis with his son to march with the sanitation workers. In fact, when it came to civil rights, Epton was probably more liberal than most of the Democrats in the state assembly and Chicago. At one time, he even tried to purchase the Chicago White Sox. During the campaign announcement, Epton said that, quote, if the Democrats keep fighting and don't make up, who knows what might happen after the primary, end of quote. For Jane Byrne, her support mostly came from the Democratic Party machine. One of those people who helped out was Edward Doliak, a strong Byrne supporter who was her floor leader in the city council as well as the new Cook County Democratic Party committee chair. This also meant that most of the big money came to the Byrne campaign and not to other candidates. This means that she was able to flood the airwaves with ads both on the radio and television, mostly showing her as a strong and confident leader, but not all the big money was behind her. Richard M. Daley's campaign, with his brother Bill being the campaign manager, received financial support from the Pritzker family, who owned the Hyatt chain of hotels. As far as Daley's ground support, many of those who were fired during Mayor Byrne's purge of superintendents flocked over to Daley, which made him more competitive in places that were considered Byrne strongholds. Because he really couldn't compete with Byrne financially, the ground game is what they went with. As was mentioned earlier, his volunteers gathered over 300,000 signatures to place his name on the ballot. In the first debate, Washington stole the show. Not only did he understand the issues, but came across as a black politician that many white people might vote for. With that, black voters started to flock over to the Washington campaign to help out. It was the first time that a victory was possible for a black candidate in Chicago. As for Byrne and Daley, they were able to hold their own in the debate and didn't make any major gaffes during the debate, but still, Washington was the highlight of that debate. However, in the next few debates, Washington would sharpen his knives and focus on Byrne. He would go on to say that Chicago was the organized crime capital of the world and that Byrne's administration had institutionalized racism in the city. And though Washington had his own baggage, such as his income tax conviction, neither Byrne nor Daley ever brought them up during the debates. Still, Byrne came across as strong in these latter debates. Daley wasn't as strong since he wasn't particularly a strong speaker and focused more on Byrne hiring image consultants than on the issues facing the city. The race that looked like it was a Byrne-Daley matchup was quickly becoming a Byrne-Washington-Daley matchup. On January 24th, the Sun-Times with WMAQ Channel 5 released a poll showing that Byrne was up on Washington by 20%, with Daley finishing third. But there was also scandal, as there always is. Continental Air Transportation Company out of Kalamazoo, Michigan, was a bus company that had exclusive rights to operate buses from O'Hare Airport to the Loop. However, they also owned two taxi companies in the city, and Mayor Byrne opposed the company having a monopoly on traffic from O'Hare to the Loop. Continental sold off their bus company to a Chicagoan, Thomas Meagher, thus relinquishing their monopoly. However, an attorney for Checker Motors, the former owner of Continental in Kalamazoo, said that the company was forced to sell the entity. Two of those involved with the negotiations were William Griffin and Mike Brady. Remember these two guys. After leaving the mayor's office after the police chief debacle, they started their own consulting firm. Additionally, Mayor Byrne appointed Griffin to the Regional Transportation Authority and Brady to the Chicago Transit Authority. As soon as the story broke, non-machine aldermen in the city council called for an investigation, as well as the state's attorney, Richard Daley. Since he was running for mayor, Daley handed the investigation over to a subordinate, and the FBI looked into it as well.
Daley was attacking the mayor's associates, William Griffin and Michael Brady, for their reported involvement in a transportation deal involving an airport bus company. Though Daley said he would recuse himself from the investigation, his office is looking into it.
They'll play like any type of role that should be played from a viewpoint of the prosecutor's office.
It was becoming apparently clear to the Byrne campaign that Daley was no longer her closest rival, but Washington was. In the last days of the campaign, Byrne spent more time in black communities, and Ed Verdoliak held a meeting of Northwest Side precinct captains, which was a private meeting. But when leaving the meeting, David Axelrod, yes, that David Axelrod, who was a reporter for the Chicago Tribune at the time, reported that Verdoliak also acknowledged that Washington was Byrne's main rival, and that, quote, "It's a racial thing. It's about keeping the city the way you know it," end of quote.
I never said that.
Is it a racial thing?
Unfortunately, there are a lot of people going to vote for Harold Washington because of the color of his skin. There are a lot that are going to vote for Byrne because of the color of his skin, and Daley for the color of their skin. All of those people for voting that way are wrong.
This is Carol Marine reporting. Early this morning, while he was campaigning with the mayor in his own 10th ward, Alderman Edward Verdoliak flatly denied a report that he made racial remarks about the election in front of precinct captains yesterday. Still, we talked to two people who were at that meeting yesterday, and they insist they heard Edward Verdoliak tell precinct captains, "Don't kid yourself, this is a racial issue." But this afternoon, Verdoliak once more vehemently denied ever making such statements. And he responded to candidate Harold Washington's charges of racism, as well as charges coming from the Daley camp, that the regular Democratic Party headed by Verdoliak was spreading racist and defamatory literature.
Harold's a candidate who's running very hard, and 15 years I've been in politics. He and Rich Daley are not winning, so they're going to say a lot of things because they're trying to make some publicity. I can't blame them for that. That's part of the game of politics. But you're not going to put words in my mouth.
I've said all I ever intend to say about Mr. Verdoliak in reference to this campaign. He has lowered this campaign to a base level which is insulting to the people. And even though we, the three candidates, have at times been abrasive and maybe slightly intemperate, never do I recall that any of us have ever stooped to fomenting crass, dirty racism in this campaign. And I call upon this mayor again, as she fades into the twilight at the end of her reign, to make it clear that she does not support, even remotely, Mr. Verdoliak's statement. That's the kind of thing that is bad. We have a volatile situation. We have struggled for 110 days to bring sanity, or start bringing sanity in the city by eschewing racism. We've talked about race relationships and race pride. We've eschewed that. And here at the last moment, afraid that he will not be able to continue to reign over the city and use this mayor as a puppet, he's gotten excited and resorted to the last defense of all scoundrels and demagogues. He has raised a race banner. Well, I hope he impales himself on his own petard. He deserves it.
Because of this shift, Byrne's campaign strategy also shifted. They realized that having more black voters turn out was going to push Washington ahead and not just hurt Daley. Therefore, Byrne's campaign changed, contacting voters saying that a vote for Daley was going to be a vote for Washington. Byrne's campaign manager, William Griffin, yes, that William Griffin, thought that Washington could win the election. He told national journalists prior to the election that he thought that Washington had a very good chance of winning the election. The national media immediately brushed it off, thinking that it was still a Byrne-Daley race and that an African American couldn't win. On election eve, most political pundits thought that the race was going to be close, but that either Daley or Byrne would win. David Axelrod said it would be close, but he thought that Byrne had the edge. On election day, voter turnout was huge, with nearly 1.3 million voters casting their votes. The black vote that Harold Washington had been worried that wouldn't turn out like they had in previous elections had turned out in record numbers. But for Daley, the places where he needed a strong voter turnout wasn't materializing. The voting was still heavy, but not as heavy as before. Also, a vote for Daley is a vote for Washington message would influence a lot of voters. On election night, Harold Washington would go on to win the Democratic primary. He would win 424,324 votes, and most of his vote was concentrated in the African American and Hispanic neighborhoods. As for Jane Byrne, she would finish second place with 393,500 votes, with most of the vote coming from the northwest suburbs and the Polish neighborhoods and the liberal lakefront area along Lake Michigan, all in the north. As for Daley, he would have 346,835 votes, with most of that coming in the Irish neighborhoods in the south and west part of Chicago, but also did quite well in the north, where Byrne also did well. After midnight, Daley conceded to Washington and congratulated him on his campaign. Meeting with his staff and some invited journalists, Daley wasn't upset, saying, quote, "This wasn't so bad. My son died, and that was the worst thing that happened to me. This is nothing compared to that." End of quote. He would call Harold Washington to congratulate him and throw his support behind Washington in the general election. Jane Byrne waited until the next day when the results were absolutely clear and gave her concession speech. Afterwards, she went to her campaign headquarters and cried. Byrne would later say in her autobiography that it felt like she had suffered a death in the family. She also threw her support behind Washington in the general election. The next day, she left for Palm Springs. As for Harold Washington, he finally appeared around 2 a.m. at McCormick Inn Hotel, where he addressed the crowd and accepted the nomination of the party. Of course, there were a number of reasons why many Democrats weren't enthusiastic about Washington's win, whether it be race or the possible threat he posed to their livelihood by taking away their patronage jobs. The Democratic Party machine suffered a bigger loss than in 1979. While they were able to make amends with Jane Byrne back then, they knew they wouldn't be able to do the same with Harold Washington. Many now turn to the tactic that the party machine would have used if Byrne hadn't complied in 1979, which was helping the Republican opponent win. Bernard Epton, whose campaign office consisted only of his daughter manning the fort, was now in the spotlight. As he said earlier, he never knew what would happen after a Democratic primary. Now he would find out. The first person to see an opportunity of an Epton win in Chicago was Republican Illinois Governor Jim Thompson, who brought a number of his campaign staff to take over the operation. He also hired media consultant John Deerdorf, who had helped a number of moderate Republicans win nationwide. The campaign that was considered insignificant a few days ago was now getting an injection of money, consultants, volunteers that it had never seen before. But switching back over to Jane Byrne for a second, her fight wasn't over yet. When she came back from Palm Springs, many of her supporters talked about having her as a write-in candidate for mayor. While rejecting it initially, she would eventually announce on March 16th that she was seeking the office as a write-in candidate. Many who were part of her campaign staff just a few weeks earlier were now conveniently out of town when calls came in to help with the write-in campaign. Remember, no cell phones back then. But there were a number of diehard Byrne supporters who also shut down the idea. One of those was Edward Doliak, who released a statement saying, quote, "I am not or will I be participating in any write-in campaign for any other candidate." End of quote. While Byrne had an uphill battle just to win, she also had an uphill battle to be considered a write-in candidate. She approached the Board of Elections to ask for a change that would allow write-ins to participate, but they refused. She eventually stopped her campaign, but didn't endorse any candidates. There would later be rumblings of Byrne replacing Epton as the Republican candidate, but that never materialized. There were only 7 weeks between the primary and the general election, which was to be held on April 12th. But immediately after the primary, the general election was shaping up to be the closest and dirtiest in decades. Very little actually separated Washington and Epton when it came to the issues. However, there were a few areas of difference. First, and most obvious, was that one was a Democrat and one was a Republican. Second, while Washington said he was going to clean out most of the patronage jobs, Epton said that those who did their jobs well could stay. This pleased many in the Democratic Party machine who were afraid of losing their jobs under Washington. Third, Harold Washington had a lot of problems, including not filing taxes, not providing legal services for his clients, and having his law license revoked, while Epton didn't have these issues. And fourth, Epton was white, Washington was black. While neither candidate directly attacked the other's race, there was a political ad from the Epton campaign which had racial overtones and would become a major story of the campaign. The ad, entitled "Before It's Too Late," implied that voters needed to vote for Epton before Chicago elected a black mayor. It had similar tones to the "A vote for Daley is a vote for Washington" message during the primary. The ad was created by John Deerdorf, with the campaign saying that the message was about how Washington was irresponsible with his finances more than it was about race. But legendary Chicago Sun-Times reporter Mike Royko said that Deerdorf used hints of race in previous commercial for other candidates. For example, Deerdorf created an ad for a Virginia Republican who was running against Democratic U.S. Senator Chuck Robb, in which the ad emphasized that Robb voted in favor of making Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday a national holiday. Royko asked, "Who was this ad for?" The answer was to appeal to the racist vote. This Epton ad was highly criticized for the same reason, though the campaign insisted that it had to do with Washington's character and not his race. Each of the campaigns had their issues that they needed to deal with within their inner circles. For Washington, he needed to keep Jesse Jackson out of the spotlight. Jackson was not popular amongst white voters, but comments that he had made about Jews, as well as befriending PLO leader Yasser Arafat, meant that he needed to have a lower profile in this race. But otherwise, Washington focused more on keeping the party together as well as the city. His tone was much softer than it was during the primary. As for Epton, it was a little different. When his son, who was running as a Democratic Socialist candidate for Ann Arbor, Michigan City Council, was asked if he would vote for his dad, he didn't answer, saying that he probably agreed more with Washington than his father. His father told him to never come back to his house again. This would not be the only time that Epton showed his temper. When Epton's chief policy advisor, Haskell Levy, angered at the "Before It's Too Late" commercial, approached Epton and said that he needed to repudiate racism in the campaign, and if Epton didn't do so, that he would vote for Washington, Epton threw Levy's coat, jacket, and briefcase out the door and said, quote, "Get the fuck out." End of quote. He also ranted in front of over 1,000 Democrats who were supporting him about how the media was treating him like the communist in Russia and that he was going to threaten to sue the media for unfair coverage of his campaign. These rants kind of became commonplace with Epton. But then the attacks started getting over the top. Republicans were saying that Harold Washington was involved with children in an inappropriate way, something that was never even remotely proven to be true. Washington's campaign said that Epton was exaggerating his war record, but still, race was all that the media was talking about. Washington's campaign said Epton's campaign were stoking the flames of racism, and if things got out of hand, that some innocent people could wind up dead. But one of the most interesting things that leaked out during the campaign was that Epton had been seeing a therapist for depression. While the Washington campaign didn't do anything with this, the newspapers were tipped off and reported on it. Eventually, Epton's health, physical as well as mental, became part of the story, especially since he had many of these loose cannon situations with his temper. Still, it looked like the election was going to be close. Ed Verdoliak, who endorsed Washington, told him 2 weeks before the election that he could possibly lose based on a poll by his people. While Verdoliak technically endorsed Washington, most of his supporters were knocking on doors for Epton. This was true in many Irish and Polish neighborhoods as well. In Daley's 11th ward, voters were asked why they supported Epton, even though their ward was a bedrock of Democratic support. Many said that they felt like the media had been calling them racist for supporting Epton, but never answered the question as to why they were actually voting for Epton. Spoiler alert, Epton won the 11th with 74% of the vote. Roman Pujinski, the 41st Ward alderman who ran against Michael Blandick and Harold Washington in the 1977 special election, endorsed Epton, and spoiler alert, Epton won 93% of the vote in his ward. Still, many Democrats, but not all, would stay with Washington, even if the endorsements were only verbal commitments, with a lot of the machine quietly and also not so quietly actively supporting Epton. A week before the election, the Republican-leaning Chicago Tribune endorsed Harold Washington, stating that the only reason Epton was making this race competitive was because he was white and Washington was black. They also said that Washington would do a better job at healing the city after the election. In a poll released by the Sun-Times, Washington had 51% of the vote, with Epton having 37% and 12% undecided. Most of that undecided vote came from the Lakeshore liberals along the coast of Lake Michigan. Many of these people were socially liberal and economically conservative Democrats and claimed Mayor Byrne as one of their own. They were the ones who would determine how this election would go. When election night came, Harold Washington would be elected mayor of Chicago, but only won 51.7% of the vote. Bernard Epton won 48% of the vote. While the Lakeshore Liberal vote slightly benefited Epton, the turnout in these areas were much lower than in black neighborhoods that, again, had high record turnouts. That night, reporter Peter Nolan was invited to where Epton was watching the results to take an interview with the Republican candidates. Epton was surrounded by many Republican bigwigs, including Governor Thompson and Lieutenant Governor George Ryan, who would eventually become governor and go to prison like so many other Illinois governors. Even though it was still not clear who was going to win at that point, Epton won off on the media, calling the Sun-Times and the Tribune journalists slime and bigots. The next day, Epton got on a plane and left for Florida, thus ending his campaign. He had lost. In 1986, Epton would try to recapture the nomination again for the 1987 election, but the Republicans rejected him. As for Washington, when he gave his victory speech, he struck a more conciliatory tone, saying that he wanted to reach out his hand in friendship and fellowship to every living soul in the city. And with that, the election was over. Harold Washington would go on to serve as mayor, having epic battles with Ed Verdoliak in what was called the Council Wars. In the next election in 1987, Washington was again challenged by Jane Byrne in the Democratic primary, with Washington only beating Byrne by 2.64%, or 79,238 votes. His general election opponent would be Ed Verdoliak, who would run under the Illinois Solidarity Party, which is another video that's coming in the future. Washington would defeat Verdoliak by 4.36%, making it another close race for the mayor. However, 6 months after his re-election, Harold Washington died in his City Hall office. The special election to replace him was won by Richard M. Daley, who would go on to be mayor of Chicago for 22 years, surpassing his father, who had been mayor for 21 years. His Republican opponent was Ed Verdoliak, of course, who only won 3.5% of the vote. But those who were loyal to Washington eventually started the Harold Washington Party, which finished second with 41% of the vote. Maybe that's a video for another day as well. Let me know if you'd be interested in hearing about that. To this day, there is still debate as to whether race was a deciding factor. Some have argued that the scandals surrounding Washington, such as his conviction for not filing his tax return or his issues regarding his legal practices, were just as much of a factor as race. But yet, many white voters rejected Washington by voting for Epton and then Verdoliak in 1987, but black voters also rejected Richard M. Daley in 1989 by voting for the Harold Washington Party. So yes, race did play a part. But was it the deciding factor? It seems like the swing vote were those who were actually looking for good governance and not taking race into account. In reality, race did matter, as well as the scandals, as well as everything else under the sun. And with that, we've come to the end of this video. I want to thank you all very much for watching. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe and press the little bell to be notified about new videos. If you would like to support the channel, you can join me on Patreon with the link below in the description. I'll be putting special members videos on Patreon, such as the new Sister Soldier video that is up right now. Again, thank you very much, and I will see you in the next video.